Hello, everyone. Welcome to our latest webinar in the virtual West Virginia Historic Preservation Conference series. Thank you all for being here today. We're really excited to have you all and to also welcome David Abruzzi with Cacapon Preservation Solutions to present today. His topic is We Are All Storytellers, the Art and Neuroscience of Storytelling at Paw Paw Story Told Through Historic Buildings. So we will be hearing from David today. And if you have questions, you can feel free to put those in the chat or hold those till the end and we'll have some discussion time. But just want to say thank you all and thank you, David. Go ahead, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. So I'm rather new to the art and craft of historic preservation, but as an architect with a lifelong interest in history, it was a natural fit for me after I left the working world in 2014. My focus and interest since 2023 has been the town of Paw Paw, where I authored 4 successful individual building nominations to the National Register of Historic Places in 1 year and have positive determinations of eligibility for 2 more. I believe buildings tell a story of place better than any other method. Buildings are tangible and serve as a way to capture our history in a concrete way that written records or signage cannot. History is not about saving the biggest, fanciest homes because their story doesn't exist without the supporting cast. Too often we have written off entire neighborhoods because they appear to be architecturally unimportant, yet they are critical to our story and narrative, and their loss makes telling the complete story nearly impossible. Okay, I have to figure out how to advance the slide.
Okay, how about in your corner down here? Are you on 2 screens?
No, just one screen.
Okay, that might be the
The arrows
presentation.
don't do anything. Oh, wait, here we go. There we go.
Okay,
Sorry about that. The
no
genesis,
worries.
the genesis for my topic today came about after attending my first Preservation Alliance of West Virginia board meeting back in November. We met with the facilitator to work on the Alliance's strategic plan, and the first question posed by the facilitator was essentially, what does the Preservation Alliance do and how do we do it? The answer to that first part of the question, what we do, was relatively straightforward. We seek to further preservation of historic buildings in West Virginia. And after a bit of discussion as to how we do it, the consensus was we are storytellers, and that is arguably the best way to gather support for preserving built history. Helping people make an emotional connection to a historic building or group of buildings through an interesting factual story can go a long way to gathering support for preservation. In submitting the topic for this conference, we were asked to provide 2 to 3 objectives as to the reason or purpose for the presentation and what we hope the attendees would walk away with or retain after the presentation was done. So here are the 2 objectives I hope to cover by the end of my time today. So these are the main points I plan to hit. I am neither a scientist nor a writer, but I do enjoy a good story. And for those who like their nonfiction with a bit of honest flair, creative nonfiction is known to provide a catch and a hook, which can apply to our role as advocates for historic preservation. I also want to touch on the West Virginia Liars competition, since I believe the guidelines and criteria provide a good foundation for what we want to do as honest storytellers of history. We humans crave connection with each other and with the broader world around us. The longing to connect is baked into our DNA, the result of an evolutionary process that favors caretaking and cooperation over solitary individualism. And one of the many ways we humans connect is through stories. Modern neuroscience is just now confirming what storytellers have known all along, that the power of stories go well beyond that of just conveying information. They also bring us great pleasure. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, widely acknowledged as the father of flow, noted that reading is a universal flow activity. By offering us immersion in alternative realities, stories allow readers to lose themselves in characters and situations while lighting up the learning and pleasure circuits of the brain. Full disclosure, I lifted this from the opening paragraph of my wife's MFA thesis in creative writing, aka fiction, at West Virginia Wesleyan, since I believe it also serves as a good starting point for my presentation today. While we as historians do not operate in the realm of fiction, we are storytellers. Whether stories are fiction or nonfiction, the audience is looking to escape and put themselves in the story. And when we attach it to a historic building, something that is tangible, the escape or connection can be easier to make. And if we bring personal facts about the inhabitants of the building and build a story around them, it can strengthen that connection. So why stories? Let's begin with the campfire ritual. And while we as historians and storytellers likely aren't talking about the historic significance of a building and the value of preserving it around a campfire, although at last year's conference we did meet around a fire one evening to socialize and talk about history in lime kilns, we do often engage with the public outside of their normal work hours, especially as it relates to historic building tours. Most Americans typically spend their daylight hours during the week at work, which allows them to spend nighttime or weekend hours attempting to hopefully tune out their daily concerns and perhaps bond via conversations and spark their imagination with stories. Fire was originally responsible for this division around 400,000 years ago when humans first mastered fire. Fire is also said to have created a division of labor where some headed out on hunting trips or in search of wood, leaving others to tend the flame. This created new social interactions where those who went out brought back stories to share or regale with those who stayed behind. As storytellers interested in historic preservation, I believe we bring back the stories to share with those who have not researched local built history, and this becomes important when old buildings are seen as disposable and without historic significance. Good storytelling creates a mind meld through neural coupling. And neural coupling is a neuroscience phenomenon where a listener's brain activity mirrors the storyteller's with neural patterns synchronizing across brain regions during communication. The speaker-listener connection enables shared understanding, allowing the listener to experience the narrative as if it were their own. The phenomenon has been measured through studies using MRIs. The mind meld is shown to result in neurochemical release like oxytocin, dopamine, and cortisol. This coupling moves beyond just normal communication, allowing for a shared conceptual ground that improves memory, empathy, and understanding. All things we seek when we're looking for support for historic preservation. Earlier this year, I approached our county commissioners about an out-of-cycle funding from the Hotel Motel Tax Fund for a self-guided historic tour of Needle sites across Morgan County. While the county commissioners did not vote to fund my out-of-cycle request, I was encouraged to return at a later date. More importantly, we had a short conversation about the history of these sites and why they remain important to the county's history and how sharing the sites via a self-guided driving tour could encourage their preservation and support tourism across the county. A well-told and emotional story can trigger the release of oxytocin, which is often referred to as the bonding hormone, because it helps build bonds, trust, empathy, and compassion. The challenge for storytellers is attention spans are short, and I think most of us could make a case they're getting progressively shorter. Telling a story that releases oxytocin and other neurochemicals can keep a person's attention span longer and make them want to pay attention to us. PowerPoint isn't usually considered the best way to do that, but when you need to do that, the question becomes, what story do I want to tell? Because no one really bonds over PowerPoint, but rather the shared experiences created between the storyteller and the listener. Before I jump into the chemical side of things, it makes sense to talk a few minutes about the art of storytelling. According to the creators of South Park, we as storytellers should use the words therefore and but instead of and then to connect the scenes of the story. This creates tension and conflicts for the listener. In putting this presentation together, I looked at multiple ways on the art of how to best structure a story. Most methods are based on a list of words that begin with the letter C and contain anywhere from 3 to 7 C's. I settled on this list of 4 C's of storytelling since I believed it was likely the most appropriate for us as historians. Character, the focus of the story, the person, the organization, the object, in our case, the building, that adds perspective and allows the audience to empathize. Context, the setting, background, and circumstances that define where and when the story takes place. Conflict, the central tension or obstacle the character must face, which drives the narrative forward. Conclusion, closure or change. The result, the resolution of the conflict and the lessons learned, which connects the story back to its purpose. So after mastering the art of storytelling, Storytelling, the storyteller can hopefully unlock the chemical pathways in the listener and tap into the neuroscience of storytelling. Dr. Jonathan H. Westover, managing partner and principal at Human Capital Innovations, has identified 3 theories behind storytelling. The first is sensory stimulation. When we hear a story, our brains react as if we are really experiencing the events firsthand. The auditory cortex activates to process the sounds of the words, while the sensory cortex ignites to imagine the details like sights, smells, taste, and movement. This transportation into the narrative creates a deeply immersive experience that captivates our minds. Stories also activate the motor cortex, priming us to simulate action and reactions. A study conducted at Princeton University showed that when subjects heard action-oriented sentences, their motor cortex reacted in a similar way as if they were performing the actions themselves. This mind-body connection helps explain why we feel tingles when experiencing suspenseful stories, almost as if we are part of the scene. The second theory looks at how stories help make meaning out of chaos. The human brain is wired to detect patterns. When we encounter information, the pattern-making hippocampus works to arrange it in logical sequences and narratives. In this way, stories serve as contextual organizers that help turn disjointed information into meaningful episodes. When we hear stories, our brains work to organize the details into coherent plots. This allows us to better digest and retain information for the future. Stories also activate the obsession-hungry nucleus, accumbens, driving our brains to crave narrative resolution. The drive for closure and meaning satisfies our need for structure and existential understanding. And the third theory considers social bonding. Because humans are inherently social animals, we are wired to connect with others. Stories allow us to simulate social experience even when we are alone. Brain scans show that hearing vivid sensory details activates the same regions of our brain that would light up as if we were actually experiencing the event firsthand. The neural mirroring helps create empathy and understanding. Character-driven stories also exploit our theory of mind, putting us in the shoes of the protagonists. This simulation of neural networks related to social cognition fosters a sense of intimacy and connection. Moreover, stories often transmit cultural beliefs, norms, and values. By taking part in shared narratives, individuals feel a sense of community and belonging. This neural basis for social connection illuminates why stories play a central role in cultural cohesion. In many respects, telling stories of historic places can easily activate many, if not all, of the 5 senses. Visual. Hopefully the building is still standing so the listener can see what we are talking about. Landmarks do that. Empty lots turned into parking lots require the listener to just imagine what once stood here. Auditory. Old buildings creak and rumble and come to life. Wood pops as it expands and contracts to changes in temperature and humidity. Tactile. Old buildings are built of a variety of materials that have vastly different feels. Modern finishes of petrochemicals do not. Even the smoothest plaster finish imparts a feel that is unlike modern sheetrock. Olfactory. Old basements and attics. Despite turning 60, I can still vividly remember my childhood and how my North Dakota grandparents' 1950s farmhouse smelled versus my Chicago grandparents' third-floor walk-up in a 1905 brownstone. Taste? Okay, maybe a historic building doesn't really hit on the sense of taste. Including stories that tug at the heartstrings makes the listener feel more human. Sharing honest vulnerability and story aids in triggering a release of oxytocin. And sharing inner dialogue of those associated with the history of place can be crucial. This inner dialogue can come from capturing oral history from those who experience historic places firsthand, written records with first-person accounts, or stories passed down from one generation to the next. Research has shown that the average human has 6,200 thoughts a day, but unfortunately, the majority of those thoughts are anxious, obsessive, or impulsive. We can bring listeners into the emotional moment by sharing some historic first-person thoughts. Fictional story writers seek to describe what does the character fear, worry, dream, hope, or plan in key moments of the story. We can strive to do the same things when we share stories of historic places. In his book, The Telltale Brain, A Neuroscientist's Quest for What Makes Us Human, Indian neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran says, It is difficult to overstate the importance of understanding mirror neurons and their function. They may well be central to social learning, imitation, and the cultural transmission of skills and attitudes, perhaps even of the pressed together sound clusters we call words. By hyper-developing the mirror neuron system, evolution, in effect, turned culture into the new genome. Armed with culture, humans could adapt to hostile new environments and figure out how to exploit formerly inaccessible or poisonous food sources in just 1 or 2 generations, instead of the hundreds or thousands of generations such adaptations would take to accomplish through genetic evolution. Thus, culture became a significant new source of evolutionary pressure, which helped select brains that had even better neuron systems and the imitative learning associated with them. The result of one of the many self-amplifying snowball effects that culminated in Homo sapiens, the ape that looked into its own mind and saw the whole cosmos reflected inside. In a 2025 article titled The Neuroscience of Storytelling, the author shared that mirror neurons are thought to be triggered inside our brains when we watch the actions of others. Many scientists believe that mirror neurons may help create the experience of empathy. The argument is that by immersing your listener in a story narrative, it can activate the mirror neuron system. When our imaginations are activated, the listener can end up mirroring the emotions of the characters we empathize with. For example, when they are sad, we feel sad. When they are happy, we feel happy. The author Jonathan Goshal called this Neverland, a magical place of imagination and mystery, which is often a lot more interesting to us than the monotony of daily life and work. The article concluded with the hypothesis: if you want to change someone's perspective about a meaningful or controversial topic, use the empathetic power of storytelling. Might be more effective to help them understand your point of view and motivate them to change. As historic preservations get people on our side, it is important to step to preserving historically significant buildings and entire neighborhoods. The more people who see that the value in preserving pieces of their past, the more likely they will fight to preserve and even save historic buildings, especially when they are not in pristine condition. My wife and a writer and I have had quite a few discussions, or some might say spirited debates, about what exactly is creative nonfiction, and how can nonfiction really be creative and still retain its factual activity. The definitive definition of creative nonfiction still appears to be a work in progress, and the individual works of writers like James Michener can often be divided into novels and creative nonfiction. And then writers like Ernest Hemingway, who wrote autobiographical works of creative nonfiction, further complicate the definition. As storytellers of history, it is important to not stray from the truth by embellishing the historical record. However, I have found period newspapers to have provided plenty of vivid imagery to make for a captivating story. And as historians researching place and people, we typically can build a factual narrative arc while covering character development as well. Creative nonfiction is often now just considered a fourth genre of literature, with the first three being fiction, poetry, and drama. This list of works is a good representation of what is considered solid creative nonfiction. I think this quote sums up where we want to be as storytellers. Nonfiction is a pleasant way to walk, but the novel puts one on horseback. And what cowboy, symbolic or real, would walk when he could ride? Why have our listeners walk when we can put them on a horse and take them for a ride? And not in a ride like a used car salesman is attempting to sell them damaged goods, but rather a short, emotional journey took them on the building's historic significance. So I've had the privilege of listening to a finalist of the West Virginia Liars competition twice tell several of his stories and witness firsthand the connection his tall tales make with his audience. And while we as historians cannot and should not delve into lies, the pacing of the story and its hooks make a lasting impression on the audience. Also of importance is the need to tell a complete story arc in just 5 minutes. I believe a walking tour that spends more than 5 minutes talking about an individual building risks losing the general audience. I consider each stop on a walking tour a separate standalone short story, yet still remains connected to the overall tour. As historians of built places, I think we often get wrapped up in the details of the building, when many of our listeners would be more interested in the stories of the people who lived, worked, and sometimes died in the places we are talking about. And I know as an architect, married to a writer, her interest and attention span for historic buildings details is pretty short. but she can appreciate a well-told, factually correct story about the building's history and its occupants. When outlining narratives for historic buildings to share with others who aren't necessarily historians or interested in building details, I believe the criteria competitors in the liars contest are being judged on are applicable in our situation as well. Technique. Is it polished? Do we come off as an authoritative expert? Is there a hook, suspense, and inner dialogue to stimulate neurochemicals in the listener? Story development. Is it chronological? As historians, we tend to share things in a chronological way, but would grouping by subject or area be more appropriate? Originality. Is the story unique? Incorporating first-person accounts make for an original story and can increase the historic value of the building central to the story to the listener. Effectiveness. Measured by public support in valuing the historic building for more than just its property value. I like to use the term monetizing history, but if that's what it takes for people to see value in saving historic buildings, then I see no problem with the term. In West Virginia and across the country, heritage tourism is the fastest growing segment of the tourist industry, and the visitors it attracts are not looking for pretty buildings, but rather those that are authentic and offer a compelling story and component to the area's overall history. Individual prettified buildings cannot do that the same way a neighborhood of properties can with a high level of historic integrity. So the next part of the presentation is on the history of Paw Paw using the story of its historic buildings. I've had the privilege of giving this presentation multiple times to vastly different audiences. I first gave it twice in the same day at the Paw Paw Festival last September to standing room only audiences, but that might have just been because it was an extremely warm day and we the speakers were giving our presentations in a tent. Although I guess it must have been okay since I have been invited back to give it again this year. The parameters were given. I had a hard stop at 30 minutes and to make it interesting to those who likely knew nothing about Paw Paw and its history. I then gave the same presentation several times as an actual walking tour during a Canal Towns Gallery pop-up event in October, and again at the most recent Preservation Alliance historic conference. After that, I felt comfortable giving it to what would probably be the toughest crowd, the lunch gathering at the Paw Paw Senior Center, since most had ties to the town going back multiple generations. From there, I turned it into a booklet and have sold more than 60 copies by word of mouth. I hope that is a reflection of hitting the mark when it comes to telling the story of Paw Paw, and not so lame as to need crutches. So if there are any questions, I can take them now, or I can proceed directly into the second part of my presentation. I'll go ahead and jump forward. As an architect interested in built history, our focus on this tour will be on events that primarily happened at or near buildings in Paw Paw that are still standing today. The town of Paw Paw is the home to 4 individually listed buildings on the National Register, as well as several others that have been deemed worthy of eligible for individual nominations. While there are more than 1.5 million entries in the National Register, less than 7% are individually listed on their own merits and significance. So for a small town the size of Paw Paw to have 4 individually listed and 3 eligible buildings, I believe is notable. Before we begin our tour, let me share some general history of Paw Paw. The town of Paw Paw was incorporated in 1891. Its population in 1890 was reported to have been 772 and peaked in 1940 at a little over 1,000. Today's population is about 420, with another 400 or so living in the immediate vicinity. But the history of Paw Paw goes back much farther than its incorporation. At the beginning of commercial navigation of the Potomac River in 1749 by fur traders of the Ohio Company, who traveled as far west as Cumberland, land in the area of present-day Paw Paw was settled by farmers and rivermen. During the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, present-day Camp Hill was used as an encampment by General Braddock's army because of the commanding view of the Potomac and its strategic river crossing. On George Washington's trips west, he often took a route which closely parallels today's highway north-south through Paw Paw. Records show Washington purchased property between Paw Paw and Orleans, and he described the land in the shape of a horseshoe, a river running almost around it, 200 acres of rich, low ground with a great abundance of walnut trees. As additional settlers began arriving around 1800, in the immediate area of present-day Paw Paw, a town began to emerge, and this growth accelerated in 1836 as the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company began work at the Paw Paw Tunnel, directly across the Potomac River in Maryland. In 1848, after work had ceased from 1841 to 1847, doing cost overruns and engineering issues, work on the Paw Paw Tunnel started anew and was completed in 1850. 14 years behind schedule, and at a cost nearly 20 times the original $33,000 estimate, or nearly $28 million in 2025 dollars. October 10th, 2025 marked the 175th anniversary of the completion and first watering of the canal. 2 years after work started on the Paw Paw Tunnel, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, constructing a rail line from Harpers Ferry, West Virginia to Cumberland, Maryland, reached a settlement. Shortly thereafter, 2 general merchandise stores and a train depot were constructed. The train depot you'll see later is not the original one. In 1846, the first post office was established, with Isaac Baker as the first postmaster. Local lore, the settlement was referred to as Isaac Baker's Store or Isaac Baker's Depot, and then later as Paw Paw Tunnel, the tunnel eventually being dropped in the area referred to as Paw Paw. At the bottom of River Street is where the ferry that connected Paw Paw to Maryland, and this is roughly where Isaac Baker's Store and the first train depot were likely located. Early in the Civil War, Confederate soldiers captured a company of Union soldiers. In response, the Union established a permanent Army presence in the area to protect the railroad that brought soldiers and supplies from the West. Union soldiers, numbering up to 16,000, were stationed at nearby Camp Chase, present-day location of Camp Hill Cemetery. The most famous commander of the troops stationed here was General Frederick Lander, who succumbed to injuries from battle and exhaustion on March 2, 1862, at Camp Chase. His funeral procession traveled down the Winchester-Cumberland Turnpike on the way to the train to take his casket to Washington, D.C. for his funeral. I'll take a moment to read an excerpt from a letter written by a soldier to his wife about the procession. Camp Chase, Paw Paw Station, Virginia, March 3rd, 1862. My dear Mary, I write you on the 1st and told you we were then under marching orders, which was true. That evening, General Lander was taken suddenly sick and bad, which has delayed the movement. General Lander lingered until 5 o'clock last evening when he died suddenly and very unexpected to all here. Since writing the above, we have paid the last respects to the remains of General Lander. It was the most imposing and grand spectacle I have witnessed since I have been in the service, and the occasion required that it should be. It is a cold, chilly day with 5 inches of snow on the ground and a slow, cold rain falling. We had 20,000 men formed in close column and standing on the cold ground in the snow and water at least 2 hours. From the moment the Corps left headquarters, minute guns were fired until the train bearing it away was out of sight. Then each regiment was marched to quarters, completely chilled with cold, all hoping it would be a long time before the death of another general. Our poor deceased general, though now gone to that whence no traveler returns, was not much liked by either the officers or his command. There can be no doubt that he was a true, patriotic man and a good officer in the regular army. But then I must say, and truth compels it, that he was a desperately profane, wicked man, arbitrary, and to the men and officers under his command. Love to all at home, James R. Kelly. Well, the tannery and its buildings are gone. There's no history of Paw Paw without talking about the importance of it. In 1868, J.B. Hoyt and Company of New York constructed a tannery, leather factory, in Paw Paw due to the ready access to oak bark for the tanning process, good transportation to ship hides from the stockyards in Chicago, and plentiful water from the Potomac. During the course of its operation, the tannery was operated by 4 different subsidiaries of the United States Leather Company. In the early 1870s, the company erected a building on the site for use as a school and church. This building was washed away in the flood of 1877, which also destroyed the section of town commonly referred to as Flytown. And I'm sure given it's adjacent to the tannery, we can all imagine why it was given that particular moniker. Another flood struck the area in 1924, and in 1930, a fire destroyed 2 of the 5 units at the tannery, which was rebuilt shortly thereafter. What we are seeing here are the tanning vats. These would have been indoors before the fire. Flooding in 1936 caused significant damage to the north end of town, impacting the tannery as well as the businesses of D.J. Bevins and Sons, P.E. Nixon and Company, B.H. Mosier and Son Grocer, C.A. Keifler Service Station, Consolidated Appalachian Orchard Companies, and the B&O Train Depot. West Virginia tanneries began to disappear in the 20th century as deforestation depleted local tan bark supplies. Demand for harness leather diminished as automobiles took over the roads and synthetics, such as synthetic rubber, cut into the market for sole leather. During the tannery's long run, it weathered those three major floods and that catastrophic fire. The fire caused an estimated $100,000 worth of damage, $1.9 million in 2024 dollars, and resulted in 150 men being laid off while the units were rebuilt. In December 1951, the Paw Paw Tannery, one of the last U.S. leather operations in the country, closed shortly before Christmas with no warning. The last major vestige of the plant left standing was the water tower that remained as a landmark for years until it was demolished on October 1st, 2011. From 1868 until 1951, Paw Paw essentially operated as a company town. The majority of the men in the area worked for the tannery and had little reason to go elsewhere. And those that did not work for the tannery primarily worked for either the orchards, the railroad, or one of the stores in town. So with some general history out of the way, we can begin our walking tour. On our first stop on this tour is the former St. Charles Catholic Mission Church, built in a simple Gothic revival style by the Vevins family in 1876. It is one of the oldest buildings standing in Paw Paw. The family sold the property to the Richmond Diocese on Christmas Day, 1876, for $1. The church is listed on the National Register of Historic Places for its association with the small Irish Catholic minority who settled in the area. It is one of the oldest Catholic mission churches remaining in both West Virginia and Virginia. Across Ruth Bevins Lane is a monument to the first African-American Methodist church in Morgan County. The monument reads, quote, "On this site from 1888 until 1996 stood the Mount Olive United Methodist Church, formerly Paw Paw Methodist Episcopal Church, built by trustees William Blue, William Rubaugham, George Gales, James Johnson, James Howard, Charles Butlett, and Thornton Taylor," unquote. The Morgan Messenger, our county paper, reported that on December 23rd, 1894, the church held a jubilee to celebrate the paying off of their debt, and the entire town, black and white churches, came together to celebrate the occasion. The Morgan Messenger reported the choir from the White Emmy Church rendered excellent music, which caused the parson to say, "The colored people used to be noted for fine singing, but if they wanted to beat that, they would have to get up and dust." We will now head down Winchester Street toward what old-time locals refer to as downtown. Before we talk about the Paw Paw Town Hall building, on the lot next to it stood the building General Frederick Lander took over to serve as his headquarters in Paw Paw during the Civil War. The Paw Paw Town Hall was built in 1942 by Atlee Hott as the headquarters of Consolidated Distributors. The company was created in 1928 to market Paw Paw's fruit around the world under several different labels, including Skip's Best Apples, named after the packing house supervisor, and Uncle Port's Apples, which was named for one of the Miller brothers. The building is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places for its role in Paw Paw's place in the apple industry. We will now continue down Winchester Street to the 1940 Consolidated Orchard Packing Plant and the 1882 B&O Training Depot, both of which are eligible for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places. Like the tannery, Paw Paw's history was also shaped by the orchard industry. In 1894, three Miller brothers came to Morgan and Hampshire counties to raise fruit. By 1910, there were more than 150 commercial orchards in Morgan and Hampshire counties. For information from an old pamphlet on the Paw Paw apple industry, Henry Miller started his first orchard with several thousand peach trees. Mr. H.W. Miller had established his orchard in Paw Paw in 1898, and in 1912, he and his brother combined their orchards, the Imperial Orchard, Allegheny Orchard, and Martin's Mountain Orchard, into the Consolidated Orchard Company. In 1920, Consolidated built its first packing house. A 1919 census of orchards by the West Virginia Department of Agriculture recorded eight orchards in Paw Paw with an inventory of 68,700 apple trees and a crop of 32,200 barrels, nearly 105 bushels of fruit. The Mountaineer brand of apples, grown and packed by Consolidated, was patented in 1924. The company established its offices in Paw Paw for handling fruit produced locally by large and small producers. In addition to Consolidated, there were several other smaller companies and packing houses located in the area. In July 1939, the Consolidated Packing House burned down, requiring the use of nearby packing plants to make it through the season. By 1940, a new modern packing plant, seen here, was ready and capable of storing 130,000 bushels of apples, roughly about 13 million. This plant was expanded over the years. By 1963, it increased in size to allow for another 75,000 bushels. On April 16, 1948, Consolidated Orchard hosted the dedication of the B&O Railroad Paw Paw Pullman car. The car was assigned to the Capital Limited route from Washington, D.C. to Chicago. B&O chose to dedicate a Pullman car to Arna Paw Paw because of the importance of Paw Paw as an apple-producing center and the prominence of Henry Miller Jr. as a producer, shipper, and apple authority throughout the United States. In 1976, Consolidated was sold to a group of investors from New York and California, and the management shifted to San Francisco. At the time, the company was picking well over 550,000 bushels of apples, around 55 million, annually, and stored nearly 325,000 bushels in refrigerated and climate-controlled buildings. The company employed 85 to 90 workers year-round in the orchards and the packing houses, with the number of employees growing to more than 200 during the harvest season. The orchard industry in Paw Paw came to an abrupt end after the severe Election Day flooding in November 1985, when the Potomac River crested in Paw Paw at 54 feet, nearly 29 feet above flood stage. At the time, the packing plants were full of apples, having just finished the picking season, wiping out an entire year's crop. The B&O train depot, owned by CSX and sitting vacant since 1961, was designed by noted B&O architect E. Francis Baldwin in a Victorian style in 1882. Murray Zeiler sold the land to construct the depot to the B&O Railroad, with the caveat written into the deed that it would revert back to her, and I would assume her heirs, if it ever ceased to be used as a depot. Here in front of the train depot was where one of the most infamous events in Paw Paw's history occurred. On Saturday, October 14th, 1904, John Price shot and killed 3 Italians who worked for the B&O Railroad. Price and the Italians were traveling by train from Cumberland, and an incident occurred where an Italian was pushed into Price and a fight ensued. When the train arrived in Paw Paw, Price ran to the Nixon and Hinkle store, today the site of the Liberty gas station, and asked for a gun. The clerk, Baker Flora, refused him, but Stoner P.E. Nixon provided Price with a revolver. Price returned to the depot, and a shootout occurred, with eyewitnesses saying 19 shots were fired. After shooting the 3 men, it was reported Price then proceeded on his way, delivering a package to Dr. McBee's confectionery store, where he worked as a clerk. Price was eventually acquitted of murder, but pleaded guilty to a charge of involuntary manslaughter and was given a sentence of 30 days and fined $75. Following his acquittal, John Price feared for his life, since the Italian Black Hand Society threatened retribution for his killing of the 3 Italians if he was found not guilty of murder. The Price name has a dark history in Paw Paw. Sherman Price, who most newspapers reports stated was John Price's brother, murdered George Pomp Largent, shooting him through the mouth and wounding 2 of his brothers in a fight at the Paw Paw picnic grounds in August 1889. Sherman Price fled the picnic grounds and disappeared. Sherman's father Samuel and brother Stanley were convicted as accessories before the fact and sentenced to prison. Sherman Price was eventually apprehended in April 1906 after killing an Italian road worker in Grant County. Reports are he used the same claim of self-defense that John Price successfully used in his trial a year earlier and was likewise acquitted. The train depot was also the site of several robberies. The July 20th, 1904 edition of the Hampshire Review reported a nighttime telegraph operator, A.C. Robinette, had a badly swollen head, the result of an assault by a masked man while on duty. They sneaked up from behind and struck him on the back of the head with a blunt instrument. He was unconscious until a brakeman revived him. His pocketbook and $5 were taken, but the robbers left his watch behind after removing it from his pocket. In 1919, the Piedmont Herald reported the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad station at Paw Paw, West Virginia, was broken into by unidentified parties, and the safe, left unlocked, robbed of $41.50 in cash on Friday night. Entrance was gained through a window. Checks in the safe were unmolested. The safe had been unlocked because the combination had been forgotten. Mary Zeiler's husband, Jacob Zeiler, had, after the passage of time, can most charitably be called a colorful history. He is known for running the Harmonious family out of town for owning slaves, then assuming ownership of their general mercantile business. It is likely this occurred around 1862 when Xyler replaced William Harmonius as the postmaster of Paw Paw. In July 1880, Jacob Xyler got into an argument with Newton Largent and fatally stabbed him. Xyler was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and fined $500 in addition to serving a prison sentence. However, Jacob Xyler is likely best known for shooting of the circus man for taking an apple from the Xyler orchard, which was behind the train depot. The shooting occurred in 1883. And newspaper reports of the incident stated the circus man was not seriously wounded. We all know that Mr. Xyler is not a man to be trifled with in that way. Jacob Xyler died in 1884, and his obituary noted he had a nasty temper that on more than one occasion led to bloodshed. Circus performances were not uncommon given Paw Paw was on the B&O main line between Baltimore and Points West. Harry Houdini is known to have performed in Paw Paw before he became a famous musician. While there's no newspaper reports of the performance, Harry Houdini's diary notes he and his wife Bess were traveling with the Welsh Brothers Circus in September 1898 and stopped in Paw Paw for a one-night show. The Houdinis had signed on with the Welsh Brothers because they were known for offering a steady paycheck and feeding their performers well. Unfortunately, the show was cut short due to heavy rains, and with the attendance being off, there was no dinner. The Houdinis were known for sending apples home to family in New York City, so it's quite likely they purchased and shipped some from their stay in Paw Paw. While we were standing on the original B&O low line, it is worth mentioning the line was superseded by the High Line completed in 1913-14 as part of the B&O's ambitious Magnolia Cutoff project. The 12-mile cutoff lessened grades and reduced the length of the route by almost 6 miles. The low-line tracks were pulled up after passenger service at the Paw Paw train depot was terminated in 1961. We will now head into downtown Paw Paw. This is the West Virginia State Senator P.E. Nixon House, built by local builder Fowler Hott in 1909 in a Queen Anne style and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It was the first of 3 brick homes built in Paw Paw for prominent businessmen. P.E. Nixon was a very successful businessman and a state senator. While he only served a single term, he made the most of his time in Charleston for Paw Paw. Nixon managed to get a commitment to fund the first bridge at Paw Paw over the Potomac River, which was constructed in 1928. Nixon was not only instrumental in getting West Virginia to fund a bridge that was the responsibility of Maryland, since Maryland owns the Potomac River to the low water mark on the West Virginia side, but after leaving office, he was part of a delegation that convinced Maryland to fund a road connecting Cumberland to the newly built bridge. That road is estimated to have cost Maryland between $800 and $1 million, or about $20 million in 2025. The new road and bridge also changed the traffic flow through the state of Maryland, taking travelers off the national road that ran through Hancock, Hagerstown, and Frederick for a more direct route through West Virginia and Virginia to D.C. This bridge likely saved Paw Paw and ended any hope of a sustained long-term prosperity for Greenspring, West Virginia, and Hampshire County. Next on our walking tour is the 1875 Methodist Church. While a determination of eligibility for the National Register has not been done, the backstory of this building is most interesting. The original church building was up at Camp Chase and was taken over by Union troops as a hospital during the early part of the Civil War. General Lander likely died there. Shortly thereafter, Union troops dismantled the church to make rudimentary shelters. The federal government eventually reimbursed the parishioners for the loss of their church, and it is likely the funds were used to build the fellowship room in 1920. We will now head over to the 1893 mayor's office and lock up. On July 20th, 1892, Joseph Largent sold a small plot of land to the new town of Paw Paw for $40 for the purpose of constructing a town hall. The building was constructed in a simple folk Victorian style. In December 2023, Cody Straley, structural historian, National Register and Architectural Survey Coordinator, and contributing editor to at West Virginia Explorer wrote, "The landmark remains in excellent condition and is a charming example of small town government in rural Appalachia." On December 27th, 1893, the new town hall hosted a grand ball with a large crowd of young lads and lasses in attendance. The Morgan Messenger, our county's paper, reported refreshments were served at 12 midnight and the band played until 3:30 a.m. Having read all the available town council meeting minutes, I've taken to calling early Paw Paw the place where fun went to die. despite the holding of a grand ball in 1893. While the tannery whistle governed the workday, the curfew bell here at the mayor's office marked the end of it. Curfew was set at 9 p.m., and failure to observe the curfew meant time in lockup. The town council did not specify if it was children or their parents who would serve the sentence, but I always assume it was the parents. Town council meeting minutes also point to merry-go-rounds and roller skating being outlawed. In 1906, the town ordered a set of ball and chains for the purpose of letting people out of lockup to work on the streets. The town of Paw Paw even went so far as to file numerous lawsuits over the years against Allegheny County, Maryland, across the river, to prevent taverns from operating and tempting the citizens of Paw Paw to take the ferry and imbibe. In 1904, several Italians drowned while visiting a floating tavern, likely due to the lack of taverns on either side of the river. As late as 1913, the town of Paw Paw celebrated a judge's decision in Maryland to not renew the license of a tavern in Allegheny County with the ringing of church bells. The lockup appears to have been seldom used, based on how rarely the town council reimbursed local restaurants for providing meals to prisoners, but I did come across a couple mentions worth sharing. In October 1895, a man who was supposed to be insane was confined to lockup over Sunday. On Monday, he was taken away by Sheriff Lewis Largent, Joseph Largent's brother. We can only assume the unfortunate prisoner's destination might have been the imposing and foreboding Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Weston. In November 1909, the council offered a reward of $50 for information that would lead to the arrest and conviction of the party or parties who broke open the town lockup and released the prisoner Harry Baker from custody. Local lore says the walls were then lined with metal to prevent another jailbreak. I've attempted to learn more about the scofflaw Harry Baker, but to no avail. General consensus is he wasn't a native son of Paw Paw, so was likely passing through on the train with friends and got himself into a bit of trouble. The building served as the town hall until 1977. We will now head up Amelia Street to the 1928 two-room black school, which also is individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Per an analysis of the 1940 census, the population of Paw Paw at the time was 1,044, with the black population numbering 194, or about 19%. There were 35 African-American heads of household, family units, listed in the census. Of the 35 heads of household, 57%, owned their own homes. This rate of home ownership exceeded white home ownership in the town at the time. From its construction in 1928 through the end of separate but equal education in 1954, the Paw Paw Black School served not only to educate Black students, but also as a social and civic center for the small African-American community. The school hosted a variety of activities and programs for both children and adults. This two-room brick schoolhouse was built in a collegiate Gothic revival style by local builder Raymond Hunter. He was part of the prominent Berkeley Springs Hunter family. This is the same Hunter family that started Hunter's Hardware in 1870. Over its 26 years, the school had just 3 principals, with Dr. Randolph Spencer, a former student of the school, serving as principal from 1938 until the end of the 1953-54 school year, when the school closed following the Supreme Court's ruling on desegregation. Dr. Spencer was a vocal advocate on the importance of an education and held multiple degrees, culminating with a PhD in biology and 2 honorary doctorates. He also wrote several books about his life in Paw Paw. Since there was no option for Black students to continue their education beyond the 8th grade without traveling a great distance, Dr. Spencer added a 9th grade curriculum to the 8th grade coursework. This allowed those students who did decide to travel by train to larger municipalities with Black high schools to complete their 4 years of high school in just 3 years. Dr. Spencer's efforts to improve the education opportunities for Black students in Paw Paw was recognized in 1954 with the school classification being elevated from unclassified to model rating, the highest classification for a West Virginia school. It was only the second time a school in Morgan County had received the rating, and it was likely the first Black school in the entire state to receive the award. Before we conclude our tour, I wish to share with you some recent murals painted in Paw Paw. Back at River in Winchester, across from where we started our tour, is the Be the Source of Someone's Joy mural, completed in July 2025. It was painted by several members of the Paw Paw community and organizations Empower You and Mountain Movers with the help of artist Sharon Zeismer. The American Legion Building mural, commissioned in 2022 by the Sons of the American Legion, was designed and painted by artist Ms. Kelsey Lilly of Philadelphia. The stars were done by Paw Paw school students under the guidance of Mr. Wallace. There are more plans for more murals in Paw Paw in the future. And finally, I believe it is appropriate to share a bit of information about the legacy of James Schooner Spencer. Schooner remains a local legend for his work in the orchard and his prowess on the baseball diamond. He also was very active in his community and sought to make life better for all. Back in 2011, his feats were even captured in song. Schooner's achievements include setting the record for most apples picked, averaging 200 bushels a day during an 8-week picking season. That is 20,000 apples a day, or more than 2,000 apples an hour. He set the record for most bases stolen in a single semi-pro baseball game, 9. He sold produce from his garden to help fund the creation of the Paw Paw Municipal Park. He served as Paw Paw's park commissioner. And in 1980, he was recognized by the governor of West Virginia with the honor of being named a most distinguished West Virginian for all he had done for Paw Paw. The painting by noted local folklore artist Sandy Heath was commissioned to commemorate Schooner's legendary love of Paw Paw, baseball, and his record apple picking. That concludes our tour, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. So, in conclusion, we as humans are wired for story as a way to bond and develop relationship. As historians, we can use that wiring and the associated neurochemicals to make connections with our audience to historic places. If we are successful, we can gain new advocates for our efforts to protect and preserve West Virginia's historic properties.